If I were to ask you, what was Israel's biggest problem in the Old Testament? Why did God punish the Israelites? Why did he send them into captivity? If I were to ask you that question, what would you say? David, what would you say? What was Israel's biggest problem in the Old Testament? What do you think? Just throw something out there. Idolatry. Max, what do you think?
Idolatry because of poor leaders.
Okay, idolatry because of poor leaders. I think that's what most people would say. And I think that's true. Idolatry was a huge problem for the Israelites. And it wasn't just a big problem. It was a recurring problem. It was a problem that happened over and over and over again. And this is kind of surprising, at least to me, because if you're a child of God, if you're a part of God's people, then what does that mean? That means you serve God, right? You serve God and only God. You don't go after other gods. You renounce the other gods. That's what it means to be a child of God. That's foundational to our faith. And it was foundational to their faith as well. Go ahead and open up your Bible. Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. We're going to go through a lot of scripture today, so almost all of them are going to be on the slide. If you just want to follow or if you just want to listen, that's fine. Exodus chapter 20, in the context, we see the Ten Commandments, sort of the Big Ten. And the first two commandments focus on serving God and only God. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 1, I realize the text is kind of small, but some of them, I had a lot of, I just had to squeeze a lot in there at some points. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 1, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. That's the first. You shall have no other gods before me. The second, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So here we see the first two of the Big Ten, of the Ten Commandments. The first two involve serving God and only God and not making images. But Israel, this foundational part of their faith, Israel continues to miss it. They continue to fall short. And it doesn't take long, does it? After God gives them these commands, after they say, okay, God, we will be your people and you will be our God, well, what do? Well, Exodus chapter 32 now. You guys know the story. Exodus chapter 32, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, they don't know who Moses is. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. And we know how the story goes. They make this golden calf. They worship this golden calf as the God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. So after God says, hey, don't make images, what does Israel decide to do? They're like, we think we're going to make some images, right? So they mess up, and they mess up early on, but they mess up throughout their history. We see this in Ezekiel chapter 16. If you're following in your Bible, Ezekiel chapter 16, in the context, we see that God sort of paints this picture. God paints this picture of how Israel has abandoned him. He saved them, but they have left him. Ezekiel chapter 16, we're just going to go through the text starting in verse 1. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations. This idea behind Son of man, God is not calling Ezekiel this messianic person. He's not making any messianic connections. Son of man just means the human one. That's what it means. So God says the human one. Make known to Jerusalem her abominations and say, thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. And as for your birth, on the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to cleanse you, nor rubbed with salt, nor wrapped in swaddling cloths. No eye pitied you to do any of these things to you out of compassion for you, but you were cast out on the open field, for you were abhorred on the day that you were born. So God paints this picture of Israel as this abandoned child. This abandoned child that no one cared for. People, whenever they saw this child on the road, they just left the child to die. So this abandoned child is how God describes Israel. But notice what he says, picking up in verse 6. Picking up in verse 6, God says, well, I saw you and what happened. And when I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you, in your blood live. And he repeats it. I said to you, in your blood live. I made you flourish like a plant of the field, and you grew up and became tall and arrived at full adornment. Your breasts were formed and your hair had grown, yet you were naked and bare. So God tells Israel, when no one else cared for you, when no one else was looking out for you, when the world was against you, when you were in Egypt in slavery, no one else cared, but I did. I cared for you, and I gave you life. And the imagery continues. The imagery continues in verse 8. When I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord, and you became mine. So this child, we now know that this child is a girl, this child that describes Israel. When this child became an adult, God looked at the woman again and saw that she was naked. So he clothed her. And ultimately the image is he takes this woman to be his wife, made a covenant with you, and you became mine. So this child that no one cared for, God cared for. And they entered into a covenant together. And he became their God, and she became his people. But how did Israel respond to all of this? How did Israel respond to the love and care that God showed towards her? Picking up in verse 15. Verse 15, but you trusted in your beauty and played the whore because of your renown and lavished your whorings on any passerby. Your beauty became his. You took some of your garments and made for yourself colorful shrines, and on them played the whore. The like has never been, nor ever shall be. You also took your beautiful jewels of my gold and my silver, which I gave to you, and made for yourselves images of men, and with them played the whore. So what we see is this image of this abandoned child that God cared for when no one else would. But what did they do? Well, they abandoned God, didn't they? They left God. They knew what it was like to be abandoned, but chose to abandon God anyway. And the language that God uses to describe it is language that I don't like to use personally. It's ugly language. But that's what abandoning God is. Abandoning God is ugly. It's a big deal to him. And that's why he says in verse 38, and I will judge you as women who commit adultery and shed blood are judged, and bring upon you the blood of wrath and jealousy. You see, this was a big deal to God. He punished them for this because of their idolatry. But what does this have to do with us? You know, we live in a completely different culture. We're not crafting images and bowing down to images. We're not worshiping other gods. You know, we're not worshiping Allah or Zeus or, you know, whatever other god you can name. We're not doing any of those things. So there are people who might say, well, we don't have a problem with this. We don't have a problem with idolatry today. Well, if I think that we don't have a problem or that I don't have a problem with idolatry today, then I just don't understand idolatry. Because the fact of the matter is, God's people, Christians, still fall into the trap of idolatry today. And that's why we need to understand it. That's why we need to understand idolatry so that we can see it, so that we can identify it, so that we can stay away from it. So that's what we're going to talk about in the lesson today. We're going to talk a little bit about idolatry and where idolatry makes its way into our lives. But before we can do that, I guess we have to define idolatry. Right? Before we can identify idolatry in our lives, we have to know what it is. So let's ask the question, what is idolatry? I think Psalm 16 gives us a good definition. So that's where I'm going to go to, Psalm 16. This is a psalm of David where David is praising God for everything that God has done. As a matter of fact, it's a familiar passage. It's a passage where David says, "And you will not abandon my soul to Hades," and that applies to Jesus. But David was recounting God's blessings on himself. And this is what he says, picking up on verse 1. "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrow of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips." Like I said, in this text, I think we see sort of a good working definition of idolatry. Here in this text, David says, "I have no good apart from you." Well, I think idolatry is where we seek good apart from God. That's what idolatry is, seeking good apart from God. And we see that, by the way, in verse 4. In verse 4, David talks about those who run after other gods. They're seeking good apart from God. He says, the sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. And David says, their drink offerings I will not pour out. I'm not going to worship these idols. He actually says, I'm not even going to talk about the idols. I'm not going to take their name on my lips. And David actually does that literally in the text. Our English translations translate this, the sorrow of those who run after another god, but the word God actually isn't there in the Hebrew. The English texts provide that for us to help us out. So David doesn't even speak of these. But the point is that idolatry is searching for good without God, seeking good from the world rather than seeking good from God. And that's kind of ironic, seeking good from the broken world instead of seeking good from the perfect God. And that makes sense. I mean, think about it. Why did Israel serve Baal? Baal was the god of rain or fertility. Some people, how does that work out? Some people ask, how is Baal the god of rain and fertility? Well, if you have a lot of rain, then your crops are very fertile. You have a fertile growing season. So that's the idea there. And why did Baal why did the Israelites serve Baal? Well, the Israelites served Baal so that they could eat, so that they could have a good growing season. You see, they were seeking good apart from God. Instead of relying on God to provide for them, they say, well, we're going to go after this other God. So that's what idolatry is. It's seeking good apart from God. And that's why over and over again in the prophets, idolatry is described as adultery. The prophets make use of that imagery over and over and over again. Idolatry is adultery. We saw that in Ezekiel chapter 16, where this woman that God saves is ultimately her husband, and ultimately she leaves God for someone else. But we also see it in the book of Hosea, don't we? This is probably the most famous example. Hosea, God makes sort of an interesting request of Hosea, and we don't always understand it. Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." And then in chapter 2, in verse 5, he says, "For their mother has played the whore, she has conceived them and has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and my drink." So it's obvious that the prophets use this image of adultery or infidelity in marriage as an image for idolatry. And that makes sense, because what is adultery? What is infidelity in marriage? Well, it's seeking good from someone other than our spouse, isn't it? God designed marriage where the husband and the wife seek good in each other. Well, if I cheat on my wife, what that means is I'm going and finding that good somewhere else. So it makes sense that God describes it as adultery. And we see that in this text, right? Their mother, Israel, who's described as this woman who's married to God. What does she do? She goes after her other lovers who give me bread and water and wool and flax, right? She seeks good without God. And the irony is in verse 8, and she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So Israel, going after other gods, saying, man, these gods give me all of these great things. These other nations give me all of these great things. But ultimately, God says, I gave you that. Don't you realize that? I gave you the good that you're looking for somewhere else. So I think that answers the question. I've put a lot of scriptures up there. I just wanted to sort of prove my point. Idolatry is seeking good without God. And this doesn't mean that we can't have good in our lives, by the way. This doesn't mean that we can't find good in our marriage, in our families, or in our jobs. The point is, are we content in what God has given us? Or do we try to create good for ourselves? Do we rely on God's power for good, or do we rely on human power for good? We can find good in our marriage, in our jobs, in our possessions, in our hobbies, whatever it may be. But are these things taking God's space in our lives? You know, these things don't have to totally replace God, because if you think about the Israelites, when the Israelites were serving the idols, they didn't totally replace God. They were still worshiping God, but they were also worshiping the idols. These idols were taking some of God's space. So we have to ask, do these things take some of God's space in our lives? And if those things were gone, if our hobbies were gone, if our possessions, if our marriage, if our jobs, if our families were gone, would we still be good with God alone? Because that's what David was saying in Psalm 16. With you alone, I am good. Everything else could be gone, but with you alone, I could be good. If our answer to that question is no, then maybe we've fallen into the trap of idolatry. So, can we fall into the trap? Yes, we can. Yes, we can. But what I want to do with the rest of our lesson this morning is talk about some areas in our lives where we see this, where we do fall in, where we can at least fall into this trap. One of them is our wealth. Someone said that I was probably going to speak on wealth this morning. They were right. They were right. It's coming up. But wealth can be an idol in our lives, because wealth is one of the ways that we seek good without God. With our wealth, at times we try to serve the creation rather than the creator. With our wealth, we seek good from the creation rather than the creator. We see this throughout the New Testament. Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3 is where I'm going. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, Paul is speaking. He says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness," which is what? What is covetousness? It's idolatry, isn't it? It's idolatry. The idea is the greedy person, he's seeking good from his own wealth, from his own power, instead of seeking good from God. We see something similar in the book of Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 3, "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or is covetous," that is what? That is an idolater, "has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ or God." So over and over again in Paul's letters, we see this idea about how greed or covetousness is idolatry. Why? It's because we're seeking good from broken creation instead of seeking good from our perfect God. We see this in the Gospel of Matthew. And I want to read the whole context before we actually get to verse 24 here. Matthew chapter 6, if you're following along, we're going to pick up in verse 19. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, middle of the Sermon on the Mount, I like to call it the Kingdom Manifesto, where Jesus is teaching people how to live in his kingdom, how kingdom citizens should live. And in verse 19, he says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" That section, verses 22 to 23, kind of seems out of place, but really it fits in. If we're laying up treasures on earth, then we're not seeing things properly. Our eyes have gone bad. And if our eyes are gone bad, if our eyes are filled with greed or filled with wealth or whatever it may be, then sometimes we can't even see the idolatry that's right in front of us. And that's when Jesus says in verse 24, "No one can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other." He says you cannot serve God and money. And the idea is God, right? Well, money can be a god to some people as well. That's the idea in this text. So wealth can be an idol for us. And what we need to do is we need to examine our lives. We need to examine our lives and make sure wealth isn't an idol for us, because we're all very wealthy people. We live in a wealthy country. So this potentially could be a problem for us. So let me just give you a couple of questions that we can ask ourselves, sort of to examine our own lives and see if wealth has become an idol. The first question, am I content with what I have? Am I content with what I have? Hebrews chapter 13 is where I'm going now. Hebrews chapter 13, in the context, the author of Hebrews is talking to people who are suffering, people who are going through persecution, people who are outcast from society, and they're not very wealthy people. So he says, keep your life free from the love of money, Hebrews 13 and verse 5, and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? So the author of Hebrews urges the Christians to keep their life free from the love of money. Why? Well, because God has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. You see, God is supposed to be where we find our good. Find our good from God. As a matter of fact, he says, the Lord is my helper. See, the Lord is my helper. The Lord is my foundation. Wealth is not. So that's one question that we can ask ourselves. Am I content with what I have? Another question that we can ask is where do I set my hope? I'm going to the book of 1 Timothy now. The book of 1 Timothy, Paul, in this book, he has been encouraging different aspects of the church. He's talked to the widows and encouraged them how to live. He's talked to the young men and the older men. He's talked to the young women and the older women. He's talked to the slaves. And now he's talking to wealthy people. 1 Timothy chapter 6, he says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. So Paul writes Timothy, and he wants him to tell the rich people to set their hopes on God and not on riches. But why? What does the text say? The text says, because God richly provides us with everything to enjoy. The point here is that God provides us with good, not our things. But if our hope is set in riches, then what are we doing? We're trusting in our wealth. We're trusting in ourselves, in human, in broken creation. And ultimately, if we do that, wealth has become an idol for us. So wealth is one of the things that can become an idol for us. But I'm going to add one more thing to the list, and then the lesson will be yours. Notice with me that politics also can become an idol for us. Politics or government is another way that people try to seek good without God. And we saw this in the Old Testament. We saw this with the Israelites. I'm going back to Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel chapter 16, picking up in verse 26, God says, you also played the whore with the Egyptians, your lustful neighbors, multiplying your whoring to provoke me to anger. Behold, therefore, I stretched out my hand against you and diminished your allotted portion and delivered you to the greed of your enemies, the daughters of the Philistines, who were ashamed of your lewd behavior. You played the whore also with the Assyrians, because you were not satisfied. Yes, you played the whore with them, and still you were not satisfied. You multiplied your whoring even with the trading land of Chaldea, and even with this you were not satisfied. Let me ask you a question. Who was Israel supposed to rely on for their good, for their protection? That's right. Israel is supposed to rely on God, but what we see here is they're going to these other nations. They're going to the Egyptians, and they're seeking good from them. They're going to the Assyrians in verse 28, seeking good from them. They're going to the Chaldeans, Babylonians, and seeking good from them as well. Instead of relying on God for their good, they're relying on these other governments, is what they're doing. They're relying on these other kings, these other leaders, instead of relying on their true king. That's what they're doing. We see this also in the book of Hosea. We already read this verse, but I want to read it again. For their mother has played the whore. She has conceived them, or she who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread, my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and drink. And here we see the exact same thing. In some sense, they're going after idols to seek these things. But in another sense, they're going off after these other nations. These other nations, these other governments have become idols for the people of Israel. Oh, look at what the Babylonians have. They're wealthy. We're going to go to them for help. And the Babylonians end up taking them into captivity. You see, they were seeking good from other nations. So the Israelites fell into the trap of idolatry. Guys, we can do the same thing. We can fall into the same trap where we are seeking good from government, from our political leaders. And we've seen this over the years, haven't we? There are people who believe, there are Christians who believe. I've seen Christians post this on Facebook, and I've heard Christians say that if this side wins the election, then my life is over. My life is over. Man, what kind of attitude is that for a Christian to have? Where is our hope? Where do we find our good? Is it in government? Is it in senators or presidents? We find our good in God. That's where we find our good. And look, I think the government should do good, by the way. That's one of the things that God has established governments to do. Governments are supposed to do good. And if governments do good, that's great. But we should primarily seek good from our God, from our true King. You know, this whole thing about idolizing governments and politics leads to a very dangerous place. It's come to the point where Christians just worship politics. Even though people wouldn't say that, there aren't any Christians who would say, yeah, I worship this political party or that political party. But that's what it comes to. That's what's been happening. I heard a wise man once say, if your religion lines up perfectly with your politics or political party, then what are you really worshiping? What are you really worshiping? You know, I've seen this play out on Facebook. There was a Christian man who posted something on Facebook. He said that if Christians refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance, then they're sinning. You know, I think we should say the Pledge of Allegiance. But that man is just wrong about that. It's not sin to refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, try and tell that to Daniel and his 3 friends when they refused to kneel before the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. What this man was doing is he was idolizing his politics. He was idolizing his political beliefs. Instead of moving his politics to fit his religion, he was moving his religion to fit his politics. Instead of being on God's side, he was forcing God to be on his side. I believe that you should say the pledge. So since I believe that, God believes that too. See, he wasn't on God's side. He was forcing God to be on his side. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes we say to ourselves, well, if God were alive today, he'd be this political party, he'd be that political party. We just need to stop saying that. God isn't on one side or another side. God is on his own side. The fact of the matter is, if we're honest about it, and we truly see it for what it is, both sides are evil. I guess, I should say all sides, because libertarians are people too, I guess. But you guys get the point. Both sides are evil. And Abraham Lincoln made this clear. After the Civil War, we talked about Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. And after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made clear that, look, both sides had faults. The North had faults, and the South had faults as well. I've got it up on the slides. He says both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. So here, Abraham Lincoln saying both sides appeal to God. Both sides think God is on their side, and ultimately what Abraham Lincoln says, God isn't on any side. God is on his own side. And he says, look, it may seem strange that men in the South, this is the point, I'm sort of paraphrasing, I'm summarizing here. He says, it may seem strange that these men in the South would dare pray to God whenever they have slaves. That's the point of what he's saying. It should seem strange that these men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be judged. Yeah, the South had slavery, but we're not perfect either, is what Abraham is saying. There's evil on our side as well. And we sometimes say the same thing. Man, I just don't see how those Christians who are Democrats can pray to God when they're supporting this or that. Or maybe if you're a Democrat, you say, I don't see how these Christians who are Republican can pray to God because they support this or that. We need to listen to Abraham here. Let us judge not that we be judged, because God isn't on our side. The Almighty has his own purposes. God is on his own side. Now, the election's coming up, and I mean, you guys know that. Not surprising anybody with that. The election's coming up, and if I had any advice, I would just say, vote your conscience. Vote your conscience. It's a good thing to vote. But in the end, we need to be on God's side. That's whose side we need to be on. And that's the point of the lesson. We need to be on God's side. We've got to rely on him. And if we seek good apart from God, what we're really doing is we're relying on creation rather than creator. And that really doesn't make sense, does it? It doesn't make sense to rely on broken creation when we have a perfect creator. Jeremiah summed it up perfectly. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, for what? And hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. You have the fountain of living water, but you seek good from broken cisterns that can't hold water at all. You have the perfect God. We're seeking good from broken creation. Doesn't make much sense. You know, whenever I was preparing this lesson, I kind of thought of Transformers. I don't know why. I thought of Transformers. Transformers are these cool robots that turn into cars and motorcycles and fighter jets. And I thought to myself, well, what if a Transformer went to the dealership and said, hey, I just want to buy a Toyota Corolla. What kind of sense does that make? You're like the perfect car. What do you need a Toyota Corolla for? We have the perfect good. Why are we seeking good from the broken world? Why are we seeking good from the broken world? I've run out of time. My Bible sermon app says I'm 2 minutes over. So let me offer a conclusion. Maybe there's someone who has been seeking good from the broken world. But you realize you need to be seeking good from the fountain of living water. Can we help you with that this morning? If you need to respond to the invitation, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.